Effortless Mindfulness with Loch Kelly. Experience support for awakening as the next stage of human development through micro-meditations and conversations about non-duality, neuroscience, and contemporary psychology. I'm happy to be welcoming Dick Schwartz to the podcast today. He's the founder of Internal Family Systems, called IFS, which is one of the most innovative and practical psychotherapy systems available today. Dick will give us an intro to IFS, and then we'll dive deeply into how it works, focusing particularly on different ways of accessing the authentic self and unburdening exiled parts within us. After our dialogue, I'll offer a 5-minute IFS meditation to give you a chance to glimpse your authentic self. Welcome. I'm here today, and it's my great pleasure to be with Dick Schwartz, who is the founder of Internal Family Systems, which is usually called IFS. Hey there, Dick.
Hi, Loch.
We've had such great times together right before the pandemic. I know we had the opportunity to teach together at Esalen, and then 2 more retreats in Italy that was in this fantastic place up in the mountains, and had a lot of fun with our different students coming together and kind of benefiting from our approaches.
Yeah, I remember those very, very fondly, those workshops, and got a lot out of them myself personally.
Yeah.
From hanging around with you.
Yeah, beautiful. So I'm really happy to be here to kind of go into an in-depth dialogue around helping people understand the uniqueness of IFS, because I think it's so simple and elegant, and the few things that are different seem to make all the difference. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you might just articulate a little bit about, either by saying how you discovered it or just diving right into what are some of the unique practices and the ways you work.
Okay, yeah, I'll briefly go into how I discovered it, which happened a long time ago. This is, I think, the 40th year. I think it was 1981. And I was one of those obnoxious family therapists at the time who thought we'd found the Holy Grail, and people who were mucking around in intrapsychic worlds were wasting their time because we could change all that by just reorganizing family relationships, and set out to prove that by doing an outcome study, and found that that wasn't true because the bulimic kids I was working with, I could reorganize the families just the way the book said to, and they kept binging and purging. And so out of frustration, I started asking why, and they started to teach this to me because they started talking about their parts, which was a foreign idea to me at the time. They were talking about a critic inside that would trigger this other part that would make them feel worthless and alone and young and empty. And then the binge would have to come in to take care of that part, but the critic would attack the binging part. And it just sounded like this mess, but also familiar in the sense that as a family therapist, I was studying those kinds of sequences, external sequences among family members. And they were describing these parts as if they had a lot of autonomy and could make them do things they didn't want to do. And so first I got scared because I thought maybe these kids are sicker than I thought. Maybe they have multiple personality disorder. And then I got scared also because I started to notice that I had them too. And my critic was pretty brutal, and I had a part that could binge on other things. And then I just got really curious about the whole thing. And to make a long story short, initially I made the mistake of assuming that they were what most of the field assumes. But through trial and error, fairly quickly learned that a lot of it was through helping clients dialogue with these parts and listen to them. Learned that they weren't what they seemed, that the critic wasn't just a bundle of parental critical voice, and the binge wasn't just an out-of-control impulse, but in fact, they were desperately trying to protect the client and were protecting other parts and were polarized with each other. And, you know, it sounded like an internal family, which is why I started calling it that. Mm. And so over trying this with a bunch of different clients and each time saying, well, maybe it's true for this client, but could it possibly be true for this client too? Found that, yes, it is true. It turns out it's true for everybody, that there are indeed no bad parts. Where I landed was that in contrast to most psychology, it turns out that the nature of the mind is to be multiple. And that my belief now is that we're born with them and they're all valuable and they're in our life to help us. And like kids in a family, they get forced out of their naturally valuable states into roles that might have been necessary during a trauma or attachment injury, but can be damaging later life and cause symptoms and problems. And that they are often frozen in time back in those traumas or attachment injuries and believe you're still 5 years old and they still need to protect you the way they did back then. And that they also carry what I call burdens, which are extreme beliefs and emotions that came into us through those experiences and attach to these parts, almost like the coronavirus, and drive the way the part operates thereafter. So too much of our culture in the field has conflated the part with the burden it carries. Because once they're willing to unload these burdens, it's like a curse has been lifted and they transform into their naturally valuable states. So as I was learning this from different clients, as a systems thinker, I wanted to see if I could get a map to this territory. And so I was looking for distinctions and patterns, and the big distinction that leaped out immediately was between parts that before they were hurt or terrified or shamed were these delightful inner children. But because they were young and vulnerable, they're the most sensitive parts. So they took to heart the interactions they had with the outside world and took on the burdens of pain or terror or worthlessness or betrayal or abandonment. And once they carry those burdens, they're not so much fun because they have the power to make us totally feel that way and feel so young and scared and alone and betrayed and rejected and worthless. So we sort of naturally want to get away from them and lock them away in inner basements or abysses. And everybody around us tells us to do that because ours is a just move on culture. Don't look back. Let those feelings go. So in thinking that we're just moving on from these memories and feelings from traumas, we wind up exiling many, many of our most precious parts in these inner basements. And once you get a lot of exiles, you feel much more delicate and the world seems much more dangerous. So other parts jump out of their naturally valuable states and become protectors. And some of them protect by trying to control everything in your outside world so that these exiles don't get triggered and they stay contained. So they might try to control your relationships so no one gets close enough to trigger you, or they might control your appearance so that no one rejects you, or control your performance and accolades to counter their worthlessness. So these we call managers because they're just trying to manage both your outside life, but they'll also manage your body. They'll manage how much they let you feel. They'll keep you in your head if they need to, so you don't feel anything. They'll cloak your heart with protective foil, or they'll keep you a little dissociated, a little bit out of your body all the time, so you don't feel. So one class of protector is these managers, and despite their best efforts, the world has a way of breaking through those defenses and triggering your exiles at times. And when that happens, it's like flames of emotion threaten to consume you. They leap out from the basement or the cyst that you had them in. And that's terrifying. And for some of your parts, it feels like you're going to die. So there's another class of protector who will immediately jump in to deal with this emergency in an impulsive way, reactive way. And they don't care about the collateral damage to your body or your relationships. They just know they've got to get you away from that feeling right now. whatever it takes. So those we call firefighters, which is one of the two classes of protector. So it's, as you said, it's a very simple map.
Mm-hmm.
There are these vulnerable parts that get locked away, so we call them exiles. And then there are protectors, one group of which are managers, the other group of which is firefighters. Although sometimes some of those parts become locked up too, in which case we call them protectors in exile to distinguish them from exiles. So that's the map, aside from probably the biggest, what I feel is the biggest contribution and where we have the most in common, which is that as I was doing that work with these parts and I was trying to get my client to maybe get to know the critic rather than attack it or hate it. And I'm a family therapist, so I'm having these dialogues. I'm having clients actually talk to these parts, initially through a kind of empty chair process. But somebody said, I don't need to do the move around. I can just sit here and do it. So after that, we just, people sit there and do it. As I was maybe trying to have you get to know your critic, and I said, how do you feel toward the critic? And you said, I hate it. They reminded me of family sessions where, having two family members talk to each other, trying to get them to listen to each other, and then it's clear a third family member is interfering. And so we were taught as family therapists to get that person to step out of and create a better boundary around the other two. I started thinking maybe the same thing's happening with this inner system as I'm trying to have my client talk to a critic. Maybe a part that hates the critic has come in. So I would have them ask that one inside to give us some space or relax. And clients could do that pretty readily, it seemed, in many cases. And when they did, they would shift. And instead of hating the critic, suddenly, spontaneously, out of the blue, they would say, I'm just kind of curious about why it's calling me names. Instead of being enraged, now they're calm, confident, and curious, and sometimes even compassionate. I feel sorry for them. And I would try that same process with other clients, and it was like the same person would pop out who had these same qualities of calm, curiosity, confidence, compassion, and also creativity, courage, connectedness, and
calm, curiosity, compassion, confidence.
Confidence, I said.
Clarity.
Clarity, that was the one.
And connectedness.
Yeah, so those are what we call the 8 C's of self-leadership, because when I would ask clients who got into that state, simply by getting these parts to open space, what part of you is that? They'd say some version of, that's not a part like these others, that's me.
Right.
Or that's myself. So I came to call that the self with a capital S. And now, 40 years later, thousands of people doing this all over the world, we can safely say that that self with a capital S is in everybody, can't be damaged, knows how to heal, and is just beneath the surface of these parts, such that when they open space, it's right there. Right. And so that's where our connection comes in. And so the process of doing IFS involves first having a target part, then getting the client to access enough self to begin to relate to it in an open way. And then in terms of different from other processes that you asked about, for example, those 2 steps are not that different from mindfulness, really.
Yeah.
But instead of just observing the part or the thought or emotion, beginning to interact with it and ask questions of it and learn about its role and ultimately love it and help it transform out of its extreme role. So this isn't a model that just says, notice from a neutral place all of this and be accepting of it rather than pushing around.
Yeah.
This says that's a good place to start from, but the ultimate goal is transformation and allowing these parts to return to the valuable entities that they were originally.
Yeah, beautiful. So we can get into self. I know that, in doing this process and asking the part to give more space, that mindful witness can show up. And I often treat it as a part, as if it's halfway there, as if it's a witnessing part that's detached and observing and neutral, and then ask that to step back. So how did you distinguish that it wasn't a part, even if they said initially, oh, that's not a part that's me. You must have been curious, like, what's the difference as you investigated? What was the felt sense difference between like a smart part or a caretaking part or a mindful witness part or an enmeshed, empathetic, energetic part?
Yeah, there's an interesting question. So there is a class of parts we call self-like parts that are similar to what you just identified. And you're right, sometimes they would show up. And why we call them self-like is because they kind of mimic some of these qualities, and they could be curious and so on. But at some point I realized that, and I realized it in part because when I could access in other people more self, sometimes you'll have self, but still blended with a self-like part or some other manager. But it's enough self that the part we're targeting relates to it in a way you would expect if it was self.
Yes. Yeah.
When it's just a self-like part, then other parts don't relate to it in the same way, and it has an agenda. And there's a variety of ways you can kind of detect them that I didn't know initially. It took me a while. I was good at detecting the parts that stood out because they would say extreme things like, I hate this one, or I'm terrified of it. But you were right. There were parts that were much harder to detect.
Have a certain compassion or caretaking kind of, but they're a little codependent or kind of a therapist part that's a self-like part, but it feels like, well, it has compassion, it has curiosity.
Right. Yeah, I think of them as parentified children, like in family therapy. They're like the kids who had to become the parents. And they try really hard, but they feel way in over their heads.
Yeah. So, just to say that after being exposed to IFS, I decided I've done a level 1 training in it and then assisted Dick in a level 2 training. And use it extensively and have found it to be kind of the missing link between psychology and consciousness and meditation and awakening.
Thank you.
And awakening in many ways is what you call self-leadership. But just to say a little more about the missing link is that it's the way that you distinguish apart from a story and a belief. And, some therapies deal with it as, oh, it's a thought, change the thought, cognitive thought, or, oh, that's my feeling, and try to get beyond the feeling. On one side, you manage it. On the other side, which is more the meditative, you let it go or you observe it. So it's kind of those two extremes. Like on one side, you're managing it, repressing it. You're, fighting the inner critic, or you're on the other side, you just, oh, it's just a thought. It's just a story. There's no self. It's not real, and let it go. But of course, what we find is that that just dissolves it and exiles it, and then it comes back.
That's right, exactly.
So that, that's kind of the brilliant middle missing piece to really feel this, this patterning. So how do you distinguish it, from kind of mind states or subpersonality? Like say a little more about part as distinguished from just like, oh, that's the judging mind, or that's a subpersonality judger. What does it mean to be multiple and have these parts as just normal parts of who we are?
Yeah, where I ultimately landed was that what might be called states or subpersonalities and other systems are parts, but they're more derogatory names for parts, and that they were identifying the part with its burden. So, and they were not seeing its personhood, really.
Right.
And so, yeah, like you were saying, it's rampant in spirituality for the monkey mind to be vilified, or the ego is the big pest,
or trying to get rid of, negative states of mind, or purify or cleanse.
I had my 15 minutes with the Dalai Lama where
Yeah, that's a great story. Will you tell that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because I had read a book he did with the emotional intelligence guy. What's his name?
Dan Goleman. Yeah.
And how he talks about how we have these negative emotions, and then we have these antidotes for them, these positive emotions that you should cultivate. and don't feed your demons. Don't feed
Mm-hmm.
the negative ones and build up the positive ones. And so my big line with him was, you tell us to go with compassion to our external enemies.
Mm-hmm.
Why not to our internal enemies?
Right.
He was jet lagged, and I don't think he really understood the question.
Yeah.
And
didn't later on one of his attendants come and say something?
Yeah, I did a workshop afterwards, after my audience with him, and I started preaching IFS, and they came up and said, "Well, just so you know, at the higher levels, we basically teach what you're doing, but we don't think people, those people out there in the world, can handle these really high level ideas.
Right.
So we think they have to fight with these parts."
So this is where, I think we are in our cultural period. It's possible and really in some ways necessary, both for people who have complex trauma and for our culture that's so polarized internally, externally, that people can do it if they're given the tools. And this is one of the differences, again, from some of the other therapies that believe you have to have a self to go, you have to have developed an ego, strong ego, in order to go to the self, or you have to have had a childhood attachment bonding experience, or you can't discover, or self as this loving presence cannot possibly be available. And this is what you and I both discovered is not true, and is one of the keys to meeting people wherever they are in crisis and starting the healing process, right?
Yeah, I totally agree with what you just said. And one of my crusades has been to bring this more into the trauma world, because there is this belief that people are very, very fragile. And so there are these stages they have to go through before they can get anywhere close to their traumas, which include a kind of grounding and containment. And they have to learn all these skills. And they have to build up the muscle of groundedness or compassion or whatever it is, because they're attached to attachment theory, which, most of attachment theory I like and agree with.
Yeah.
But in attachment theory, there's this belief that if you didn't get good enough parenting during a critical period in your childhood, you don't have any of that.
Right.
And it has to come through a relationship. And so a lot of attachment-based therapies it has to come through the relationship with the therapist. And that takes time. And until that's there, then you don't have the strength to handle much. And
that's right.
There's this total fear about exceeding the window of tolerance and all of that.
That's right.
And so, as we both find, that's just totally not true.
Yeah.
That the self is in there, and like I said, it can't be damaged, has all these qualities. And when it's blended with some of these parts, people seem like they fit that profile. But if you can get these parts to open space, that same self just pops out. Not just in people who had reasonable childhoods, but, for 20 years, I worked with what's called complex PTSD and other kinds of severe diagnoses. And a lot of those clients have been tortured on a daily basis. So if you believe basic attachment theory, you'd say there's no way they could do what they could do. But if instead you work with the parts that had dominated them to the point where they're willing to separate, it's the same stuff that came out in them that came out in people who were spiritual and meditated all the time. And so that blew my mind when I ran into it in the early days, because I believed attachment theory.
Right.
And it wasn't until I had done it with enough clients that I started to really challenge and started to look more in your direction and looked much more towards spiritual traditions that knew about this, what might be called Buddha nature or Atman or, things like that.
Yeah. So, similarly, traditions in meditative tradition, particularly the ones that are more, classical and have a religious bent, like that are carrying on, they tend to go from renunciation to transformation and then on to direct realization, as if, like the Dalai Lama was saying, that you have to do this. We can't teach people this direct recognition of their true selves. But there are traditions within those traditions that say, well, let's try it. Let's see if you can do it. And you don't have to sit for 10 years in a cave or a monastery and sit 10 hours a day. It's already here. Yeah. What if, so that's the big
and that's
realization.
That's what you're bringing. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that realization that self, capital S, or awake awareness or open-hearted awareness or true nature is already here within each of us, as each of us, and is patiently waiting for us, to recognize and realize is the key assumption. And then you bring the other part. Okay, once you've found that, what's the burden? What's the problem? What's the obstacle? We need a method to not just spiritually bypass and just be the self and then come back and be taken over by our parts. What's the relationship? So that moves us from self-energy to self-leadership. Now we have, once people have done therapy for a while, once they've kind of unburdened, gone through, and now what you're calling self-leadership is really kind of how to live from that day to day, both by checking in with parts yourself during the day. Notice when you're triggered, you immediately start to realize, oh, there's a part, it's like, nails on a chalkboard. They start to realize when they're up, and then be able to access self and be with that part while you're in the middle of a dialogue with somebody.
Totally.
So can you say a little about kind of what you've seen over time about people who have been on this journey, about what it starts to look like, which is, whether there's another stage of human development, which is basically self-leadership. So in other words, if it's parts leadership or ego-based leadership or very smart, neurotic people leadership or something like that as our main goal, or is there this other level of mind, that is possible really as just a developmental stage? And what does that look like? What have you seen?
Yeah, so in this sense, IFS has become more of a life practice, even psychotherapy, because as you say, once you start identifying these parts, and people become very creative in the ways they map them out and keep track of them, much more creative than me. I'm still just, okay, there's one. And as you get better at knowing yourself with capital S from your parts, or if I get into conflict with Gene, okay, I hear you, the part that's wanting to take over and yell at her. But remember, it always goes better if you trust me and let me handle this. And I'll kind of gradually, begrudgingly feel this shift in my body, and my heart will open, and the big agenda that I had of her apologizing to me is gone. And so it's both, through the day, just noticing, but also in contexts where typically your parts get triggered. That's when it's really important to notice.
Yeah.
And so the first step is to notice. Yes. This isn't me. This is a part. And then once you notice it, ask it. We're big on asking rather than pushing or trying to ask it, remind it, comfort it, like a parent would to a child that's scared. It's okay to not take over. It's okay to let me handle this. It's okay to let me stay in my body. And then feel the shift and notice the C words coming back. Notice your heart opening, your mind clearing, so on. And then bookmarking that as something to go back to with a therapist or maybe on your own, because it's in need of healing. So people like Gene in my life are great, what we call tormentors, because by tormenting me, they're mentoring me about what I need to heal, because they're eliciting the parts that I still have to work with.
Right.
And that's a kind of different approach to life is all these what is it? Blanking growth opportunities, if you follow through and focus on and work with and heal, it becomes a virtuous cycle where then you're more self-led because you're not so burdened, and self is more in your body, and you're just naturally leading from self in the outside world more.
Right. Yeah. Beautiful. And Yeah, so you have your supportive therapist, and if you have to hire a tormentor, or you have a relationship, or they tend to show up anyhow.
Lots
right?
of them volunteer, yeah.
They volunteer, voluntary duty. So then exercising self, as in ways. I often ask people, okay, what are the ways that what do you do in your free time? Things that you love. I'll bet that you do those to access self. So things like play sports or go dancing or walk in nature, play with animals. So be conscious that it's not just about the pleasurable feelings of that, but start to feel who's there. Who is this occurring to? What does it feel like in these more easily accessed trailheads to be self? And then get that felt sense, as you say, make those markers. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, this is self. This is what it feels like when I shift into it, either intentionally or naturally, and then make that a moving meditation.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're totally on the same page with that. And,
yeah.
One of the big goals, particularly as I get older now, is to bring more self-energy to the world.
Yeah.
I think we share that goal. And so we're looking at ways to do that with groups and with world leaders and so on, if there are ways to get access. And because as you're saying, just having particularly leaders know how to access that and express from that is very healing, because self has this innate knowledge about how to heal, both inner relationships and outer relationships.
Right. And one of the beautiful things that helps bring the two together, the parts and the self, is speaking for a part rather than as a part. So we don't want to get the idea that, like when you give the example of talking to Gene or getting upset, that you're spiritually bypassing. But you could say, well, I could say with Paige, a part of me, are you available to listen to what I have to say? And she would say yes. And well, part of me feels that when you ask me to do that it feels like you're upset at me, and that I feel like you're talking down to me, or I'm feeling like I'm being talked down to. And I just need to say that for this part, because that's how this part feels. Yep. I don't feel that way, but that part has been triggered. That's how it feels.
Yeah, exactly. And on a really good day, I'll say that. I'll speak for the protector.
Yeah.
But then I'll also say, well, you did. You just did. There's a part that when that happens feels demeaned or really hurt. And then that brings this protector up to yell at you. So which is a very different message than the usual one, which is,
that's right.
Why the hell did you ask me to do that?
Right, because then you're speaking from, and you're blended
with the part you're speaking.
And even if you have this other consciousness, like, don't say it, you don't have to say it. But then you're like, well, let me say it anyway. Then I'll go to self afterwards.
Right, exactly. And sometimes that's necessary.
Sometimes
and then there's the repair, right?
Then there's the repair and the forgiveness, and So let's talk a little more about self in terms of, the amazing thing is that when people have these peak experiences or spiritual experiences, or even we can talk a little about using psychedelics and psychotherapy to get to what? Because what they're getting to is not only helping some of the parts that are exiled to come forth or have that happen naturally, but the beauty of self, when you actually feel it, it's the sense that all is well on this existential level or ultimate level. That's what people have been missing by living in a parts-based view. No matter how smart the part is, or kind the part is, or compassionate. I work with not only, severely traumatized people, but people who have meditated and spent their life doing work for the world and have good family lives, and they're mature, and they still, when they shift into self, go, oh my God,
this is different.
This, you've got to be kidding. I've been missing this. That's my work, is just to really see that you can intentionally access self, and then with your work, make sure that you don't think that's all there is. Come on back to the body and not only the body and the thoughts, but the parts that now you have the capacity to unburden and to be with and to just start by just loving.
Yeah.
By just saying it's okay. That's the first amazing compassion with a big C, is to parts that are like even a critic part. Well, it's okay. You don't even have to change. I'm just here listening.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like, what?
Right, right. And that's the other thing, is they all want to change. They hate their roles in general.
That's right.
So if they sense that acceptance, then they're much more open to the possibility of doing something different inside.
Yeah. So say something about that, just in terms of your, just having people recognize self for the first time, whether it's in a session or, if you want to say something about any of the work with therapist-led psychedelics, and what it is they get out of that.
Yeah. I'm hoping that IFS can become at least one of the primary maps to the psychedelic territory, because I've had personal experience and also been with people. And my take is, for whatever reason, each of those medicines very quickly either puts protectors to sleep or somehow has them open a lot of space, and people can access a lot of self very quickly. And with MDMA, you access self, but you stay in your body, and you're really feeling seaward compassion in a big way, and connectedness
and love.
Yeah. And that's all great. And it's also an invitation for exiles of both kinds to come in. And so it's not uncommon. In fact, Michael Mithofer, who spearheaded the whole MDMA research, is an IFS therapist. And he kept track of how often, once people did the medicine, how often spontaneously they'd start doing IFS, because they'd start talking about parts without any cueing from him or Annie, who's there. They would just start seeing parts and working with them and seeing that they'd made a mistake by locking them up and embracing them. So that's all been very validating. It seems like I stumbled onto a process that we know what to do, we know how to do, if we can access enough self, and that the ketamine takes you out of your body and takes you into that pure self state, in a sense.
Yeah.
But when you come back, there's a lot more self in your body, and you can do a lot of deep work, and people are using ketamine and IFS together a lot too. So
each one's like a different door. One is the MDA seems to be the door of the heart, and ketamine's more what I call self-essence, or awake awareness, or pure self, or awake consciousness that is beyond form, is formless but awake, and then it comes back to self-energy, and then comes back to parts, and then to embodiment. But it gives you that sense that there's something greater than yourself that's beyond the body, and yet is that boundless dimension that is also inherent within us.
Yeah. Now, the danger with psychedelics, and the danger in general with accessing self too quickly and without permission of protectors, is that you'll get what we call backlash.
Right.
And that's part of what I'm trying to bring to the psychedelic community too.
Because that seems to be like one of the, just having been part of groups that have gone through this, I've seen 30 to 70% of people have bad experiences, and what they do is they just get flooded by backlash. They're actually screaming out loud, they're crying, they're literally just blended from the beginning to the end. So it can help people who have difficulty accessing self, but it can also be immediate backlash.
That's right.
Territory, right?
Exactly.
So what would you say?
If it's during the medicine sessions, and they start to scream or something like that, then it's a simple process of just saying, okay, I see there's a part that's here that's very, very upset, and ask it to separate a little bit so you can be with it while it screams, rather than be it.
Yeah.
Or I might talk to it directly and say that some version of that, we can help you. I'm really glad you're here, but it's hard to help you. So that's if an exile comes forward, which happens. If it's a part that's punishing them for accessing self too much, which is what happened with a percentage of people that have had really severe abuse in their lives, where they they really have parts that decided they never want them to feel strong or feel good. Then when they do, because of the medicine, then these parts will come in to punish. So in that case, I would do it differently, but it's still really helpful to know that's just a part who got scared because you started to feel so good.
Yeah.
And then have the person start talking to it, or I might do direct access and talk to it and help the part see that it's really okay. Because they're, like I said earlier, they're living in the past. They really think the other shoe's going to drop any minute.
Right.
And that they got to get you back small again.
Yeah.
Something terrible is going to happen. So all of that's to say that just that perspective about what's happening with psychedelic people on psychedelics is extremely helpful. And I think can prevent a lot of the damage that can occur, that I've seen occur as you have.
Yeah. And, as Ram Dass said, psychedelics is a good window, but not necessarily a great door.
Yeah.
So there's, if we can do it in sessions and through direct intentional works, and get people to access to, maybe a good way is kind of to just finish by a little bit of a kind of going over the process of being blended and then recognizing you're being blended, whether you're being asked by a therapist to unblend or you recognize you're blended. And then that sense of asking the part if it can give you some space.
Yeah.
And that feeling, that's kind of the magic move of IFS, of what I call unhooking awareness, of even of mindfulness, is you step back. Now the question is, where do you land?
Right.
Do you land in a self-like part or a judging part or a smart part? Then asking those parts to step back and opening further until you find, self-essence that could be self-essence first, which is kind of formless and awake and alert. But then as it comes back into form, it comes back into energy like the quantum field arising as particles and waves. And then it forms into patterns or first qualities of compassion, curiosity. And then there's a relational dimension from this, which is vast and open and boundless, to compassion that's relational and can be with the part, and then the having that part feel that it's not just another part, but that there is something that self is not only relational, but is within it. So it's like ocean and wave. That interconnectedness, that connectedness is what, we're the same, we're the same family. There's the family.
No, that's
system, right?
That's exactly right. That parts have self, and
Yeah.
because they are little spiritual beings, and
Right.
if you can help the part access itself, it will feel that level of connected to yourself. And then if you can access enough self, you'll feel that with people, the selves of everybody in your vicinity,
Yes.
but then at higher levels, as you say, you feel this sense of being connected to all beings, basically, all sentient beings,
right.
which is a lot of what Buddhism's about.
Yeah.
But this is a very practical way to get to actually feel that rather than understand it as a concept.
Yeah. Or make it disembodied and not know how to come back into the body. So this is really, the beauty, I think, of IFS is starting with from one end with people who are the most traumatized and having realized that this is the way to help them. And then starting on the other end with the people who are meditating and, trying to highly evolve, that you got to bring them both together. And there's the magic of the human and the beingness, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah, great.
Beautiful. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dick. This is so wonderful to be able to dive deep and hear from you about IFS and self and all the great work you're doing, not only with individuals and your tremendous commitment to really help those individuals who are suffering most deeply, but also now extending it to groups and to go into different places around the world and trying to get larger groups so that it expands out into the world.
Yeah. It's I always love our conversations, and And I feel your support. We're kind of colleagues on this journey. And yeah, just happy to talk anytime we can.
All right. Thanks so much, Dick. And now, to add to this dialogue with Dick Schwartz, I'll offer a 5-minute IFS style meditation called Know Yourself. You might want to find a quiet, comfortable place to sit so you can close your eyes and enjoy this meditation. Recognizing self with a capital S leads us to a new kind of self-compassion practice. In the usual self-compassion practices, who is compassionate to whom? What self is compassionate to what self? This usually means that a part is trying to have compassion for another part. In the following approach, we realize that who we are is not a small self, but many parts. Then, rather than a part having compassion for different parts of yourself, there is a discovery of self with a capital S, which has natural compassion for the whole. This mindful glimpse can also be done with another person. Can you feel an emotional or energetic pattern you're aware of in or around your body? Notice what is the shape, size, location, and feeling of this part. Can you thank this part and ask it to unblend and open some space? From this space, rest as the awareness that is aware. How do you feel toward this part? Not from your head, but from your heart. Is this part aware that you are here with it? Is this part aware of your feeling of compassion toward it? And ask this part if there's anything it wants to let you know. And listen. And when this part turns to be aware of you, what does it experience as the size, location, and feeling of you? How does it feel to be aware from your open heart toward this part within your body? How is it being open-hearted self with your body and these parts? And as you transition, just continue to be aware from here. And during your day, just know that you can learn to return. and trained to remain. Enjoy. We offer this podcast freely thanks to the donations of kind listeners like you. If you'd like to be a supporter of this podcast, please visit lochkelly.org/donate, and we are grateful for your tax-deductible donation.